Welcome. We are so glad that you are here this week. We have one announcement. On April 24th, the women's ministry is going to be hosting a tea. There will be information upcoming on the website, but make sure you save the date for the morning of April 24th. Before we start into our teaching for today, we are going to transition with a time of worship, so please enjoy this worship song.
There's a grace when the heart is under fire. Another way when the walls are closing in. When I look at the space between where I used to be and this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. There was another in the fire standing next to me. There was another in the waters holding back the seas. Should I ever need reminding of how I've been set free, there is a cross that bears the burden where another died for me. There is another in the fire.
My debt left for dead beneath the waters. I'm no longer a slave to my sin anymore. And should I fall in the space between what remains of me and this reckoning, either way I will bow to the things of this world. And I know I will never be alone. There is another in the fire standing next to me. There is another in the waters holding back the sea. Should I ever need reminding what power set me free, there is a grave that holds nobody. Now the power lives in me. There is another in the fire. Oh, there is another in the fire. Oh, I can see the light in the darkness as the darkness bows to Him. I can hear the roar in the heavens as the space between west and I can feel the ground shake beneath us as the prison walls cave in. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. There is no other name but the name that is Jesus. He who was and still is and will be through it all. So come what may in the space between all the things unseen and this reckoning, yeah, I know I will never be alone. Yeah, I know I will never be alone. There'll be another in the fire standing next to me. There'll be another in the waters holding back the seas. And should I ever need reminded how good you've been
Hi, I am Carrie Martins, and I am part of the Women's Ministry Research and Writing team. And I am so excited to have the opportunity to be sharing during the teaching time this week. So for our passage this week, we are looking at the second part of Philippians chapter 2, and we are going to be looking specifically at verses 19 to 30. But before we do that, I really want to pause and look at what we talked about last week and look at chapter 2 as a whole. So when Mandy Moore was talking the first week in her study, she really talked about looking at the whole Bible and not just taking pieces. And when I sat down to look at this passage that we're going to talk about today from 19 to 30, I really sat down first and looked at it as a whole chapter. And I was so excited when I saw how what Mandy talked about last week really set the foundation for what we're going to be talking about this week. So before we jump into the reading for today, I want to go back and look at the two sections of last week. So the first section in Philippians is the section from 2 to 11. And this section is foundational. So this section shows us Jesus' example, and it really identifies the model of who we should be like. It identifies that Jesus and his life is the foundation of what our lives should be like. When we look at the words in there in verse 7, it says that he came in the form of a servant. And today, our main theme is going to be talking about joy and service. And we can't start anywhere than referring back to chapter 2, verse 7, and we look at Jesus' life and see how he is our ultimate example of a servant. After that example that we saw there in the beginning of chapter 2, we move into the next section, still chapter 2, but verses 12 to 18. And that section really explains what this type of life should look like. It helps us to understand what we should do. So when we're looking at this, we see in the first section that we have Jesus' life as a model. And then when we look at verses 12 to 18, we see what we should do in our lives, and it explains that. So we remember what was done for us by Jesus. We understand what we should do. And then when we jump into our passage today, as we're looking at 19 through 30, we're going to have an illustration of two living examples. So 19 through 30 illustrates two living examples. So it really shows us how this can be applied to our life. So as I was looking at this, as I said, I got really, really excited as I was looking at the whole of chapter 2, and I saw these words about how we can identify Jesus as the model, we can explain what this type of life should look like, and then the third point, it illustrates how we can be a living example. And the reason I got so excited, I am an elementary school teacher. I teach 5th grade. And as I was looking at this passage and how it builds on each other in chapter 2, it reminded me of something that I learned in my most basic education class. And if any of you are teachers or have learned some about education, you might be familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. And that's just like a hierarchy of thinking and learning and questions that you can ask. That's a brief explanation. And so when I looked at this passage and looked at how all these skills and ideas built on each other, I got so excited. And you can see an example. I have a picture here of Bloom's taxonomy. And I know when we look at this a little bit, I thought, I'm going to try to explain this. I'm going to try to share how excited I am. And I feel like it's a little bit when you see a beautiful rainbow and you try to take a picture and you know that the picture is never going to capture the beauty. And that's how I felt when I kind of saw how chapter 2 built on each other in this educational way. My roommate was home that day and I called her over and I said, you have to see this. You have to see what I learned about chapter 2 and how this builds on each other. And so as we're jumping into chapter the end of chapter 2 today, I just really want us to remember and focus on what we learned last week with Mandy at the beginning of chapter 2. And the two words that she even used were humility and obedience. And again, I think that connects so perfectly when we look at the first part. Our foundation is remembering what Jesus did for us, his humility, and trying to model that in our lives. And then we look at the second section, which she talked about obedience, and that is understanding what we should do. These are the things that we should do. And then as we move into the passage today and we look at this, we now have two examples of men who are living this out in their everyday lives. And we are going to have the opportunity to look at their lives and how we can also see what they're doing and see these two examples that Paul highlights and look what it means to have a transformed heart. When we have that humility and obedience and we see the transformation of Jesus in our lives, there is a natural overflow of serving. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. So the first section that we're going to look at today, we're going to be looking at 19 through 30, but Paul highlights two people in this section. And the first person who he highlights is Timothy. So I'm going to read for us verses 19 through 24. So Paul is talking about Timothy, and he says, I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. For they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son, with a father, he has served with me in the gospel. I hope, therefore, to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with me. And I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also. So as we are jumping into this first section and we are looking at the life of Timothy, we see a man who is talked about a lot in the Bible. So Timothy lived an extraordinary life of devoted service that stemmed from his love of God and his concern for fellow Christians. Okay? Timothy is well known for spreading the gospel. I'm going to turn to Acts. We're going to look at two different sections in Acts about Timothy. The first one is in Acts 16, and it looks like it talks about when he first started ministry with Paul. So in Acts 16, I'm going to read the first verses 1 through 5. It says, Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they went on their way through the cities, they delivered to them for observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and increased in the numbers. So right here, we see another picture of Timothy when Paul is first starting to call him. And this passage says he was well spoken of by the brothers. He even was circumcised as an adult because Paul thought that he would be a better testimony. So we can really see that he's willing to sacrifice himself and that he has a reputation for spreading the gospel and that he is well known for working alongside Paul. And he's also known for Paul sending him in his place when Paul himself can't go. So if we turn to Acts chapter 19, verses 21 and 22, it says, Now after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, After I have been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. So there are lots of other passages that we can go to, Acts 17, 13 through 15, 1 Timothy 1, 1 Corinthians 4, 14 through 17. Those are just a couple, and I'm saying those to make the point that Paul is giving us an example here in Ephesians of someone who is well known for being by his side and for being a faithful servant of God and faithful to minister with him. I'm going to pause right now so I can jump back over to Philippians. So now that we've kind of set that groundwork for Timothy and who he is, we're going to jump into specifically what this passage says about him and what Paul says about him here. So in these verses in 19 through 24, we see a lot of characteristics about Timothy and who he is and what he did. So in verses 21 and 22, it talked about how much he cared for other people in that way. So he says that he was genuinely concerned for his welfare. And then kind of in the opposite way, he says that he's not like people who seek their own interests. So from that, we know that Timothy is someone who doesn't seek his own interests, but is also seeking the interests of others. Then in verse 20, it says he proved himself, just like in that passage we saw in Acts, where it says that he was spoken highly of and had a good reputation. Here again, Paul has said he has proved himself over and over again as someone who is faithful to God and a faithful servant. And then my favorite part of this section that Paul highlights is in verses 21 and 22. But from the words that Paul says, we can see that Timothy is a man who is Christ focused and who is gospel focused. And again, going back to that point that we talked about, the foundation of our joy in serving this week is what we heard about at the beginning of Philippians chapter 2, and knowing that Jesus himself was a servant and modeled that. And here we see Timothy is also modeling that service, and it is service that is Christ-centered and gospel-centered. It is centered on those foundational things that we heard in those first verses in Philippians chapter 2. So we can see that Timothy is not someone who is working for his own credit. He's not serving as I said, for his own credit. He's not someone who's serving for his own ease or comfort. We see that when he's circumcised in Acts, that he is focused on what is good for other people and what will help to expand the gospel. So Timothy in his life, as I said, Timothy lived an extraordinary life that was devoted to service that stemmed from his love of God and his concern to fellow Christians. So Paul highlights a second person in this passage, and I'm so glad he does, because I think as I just listen to all these things about Timothy, even as I'm saying them right now, it can feel a little hard for me, okay, can I measure up to this? I think sometimes when I think of Paul or Timothy, I get a little bit into the comparison game, and I almost feel overwhelmed by the example. I think it's an amazing example, and there's a lot we can learn from it. But there is a second person who Paul highlights. And before I jump into the next section of the passage, I have to be honest. When I first found out I was going to be teaching and sharing on this week, and I read this passage, one of my initial thoughts was, oh no, I have the passage with a really hard name in it. So I'm going to take 30 seconds right now to teach you how to say this name. That way, if you're talking about it later when you're in small groups and you're discussing questions, you can. So the beginning of the word, the EP, is pronounced like Ephesians, so F. And then in a lot of the research that I did as I was preparing for this, said that this man, Epaphroditus, was originally named after the Greek goddess Aphrodite. So I think if you can remember that the beginning is pronounced like the beginning sound of Ephesians, and that the rest of it is similar to Aphrodite's, it's Aphroditus, but similar to Aphrodite's, it will help you pronounce it. So pronounce it correctly. And if you don't get it right, that's okay, because I still have to pause and think about it, and I quite possibly will get it wrong sometime when I'm talking about him right now. But the second person that Paul highlights from verses 25 to 30 is Epaphroditus. And he is somebody who reflects the love of Christ by serving God in ordinary, selfless ways in his daily life. And I really like how Paul, after talking about Timothy and talking about all he has done and the ways he has served, talks about Epaphroditus, because his love shows how we can serve in daily ways, in ways that might seem unseen or unknown to other people. So we're going to read the second half of this passage now. I'm going to read Philippians 2:25-30. I have thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. For he has been longing for you all and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. Indeed, he was ill, near to death, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him but also on me, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, that I may be less anxious. So receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor, such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. So here we have an example of another man who Paul highlights, who had joy in serving. But this example is quite different from the example that we got when we looked at Timothy. Partially because we don't know this man. So the church of the time would have known him. So he was one of their own. So Paul highlighted this man who was a member of the church here in Philippians. But outside of that, he's not well known. He's not well known outside of the Philippians church. The only time he is referenced in this Bible is in Philippians in this passage, and then I believe once more in the later chapters he's just referenced. So this is not a man who's well known. We have a very, very short snapshot of his life, but the snapshot we have is a beautiful picture, again, of someone whose foundation is on Christ. His foundation is on Jesus, and the outflow of his life is a life of service and looking to the interests of the others. So as we look at this passage, Paul uses a lot of words to describe him, even though it's in a very short section. And I know if you had a chance to do some of the lessons beforehand this week, this was one of the things that we dug a little bit deeper into. So in verse 25, Paul describes him as a brother, a fellow worker, and a fellow soldier. So we see that in that he's a brother, that he is a fellow believer in Christ, and that they are part of this community together. So he also calls him a fellow worker. So they are working together for the same goal. They are working together in service for Christ, so side by side. And then he also calls him a fellow soldier. So that can mean, I looked at a couple different places. In one place it said that it could pertain to how they are, again, both working towards that cause, working in the fight against Satan as an enemy and working towards helping others to understand Christ. But I also talked about how as a fellow soldier, and part of that could just be in sharing in some of the same trials and sharing in hardships and life. Because we see Paul right now as he writes this is in jail, and Epaphroditus has gone to serve him while he's in jail. But we also read at the end of this section that he nearly died for his work. So they are also sharing in some of the trials and hardships of service here. So we can see that Paul has a great love for him, even though we don't know a lot about him, even though he hasn't been serving for Paul's side as long. Really, we can make an assumption, I think, just this time right now for this purpose while he's in jail, the church sent him to help serve him just for this short time. But Paul still calls him a brother, a fellow worker, and a fellow soldier. And then, as I said, he is sent as the church's minister and messenger, again in verse 25. So we see that. We see that, that he is someone who can minister to other people. Since Paul is in jail, he might have had to run errands for him. He might have had to physically write the letters as Paul was dictating them, since Paul was in chains, maybe helping to ease his chains or sores that he had. And as I mentioned before too, it says that he helped Paul even to the point of death. He was risking his own life to complete, and it says, what was lacking in service to me? So Paul had a need, and the church saw that need, and they sent Epaphroditus to fill it. And that might have done a lot of different things. And he was so willing to serve Paul that he did it to the point where his health was failing. And I'm not saying that we always need to do that, or we should not have limits. But we can see in this example here that both Paul and Epaphroditus felt like he was serving God as he was serving and ministering to Paul. So he was a man of obvious devotion and faithfulness and self-sacrifice. But as we pointed out, he was a more ordinary man. He is not someone, at least as far as we know in the Bible, who is going out in his everyday life and going to a lot of places and serving and spreading the gospel in that way. There was a need. Paul had a need, and the church sent him to minister to that very specific need. And so just in his ordinary life, little by little, he was willing to go and sacrifice. He sacrificed his time, he sacrificed his health, and maybe some of the resources of him and also the church as they went. So, as we're looking at both of these men, I think we can see that service does not always mean paying the ultimate price and receiving recognition. So Timothy, the first example, had a lot of recognition, and maybe sometimes we do serve in those ways that are more obvious, but service does not always mean paying the ultimate price and receiving recognition. It is often being willing to be faithful in service in the mundane things that go unnoticed. And there are some people maybe who they really excel at that. Maybe they have a gifting where they are able to jump in behind the scenes and serve in those ways. And there are some people that might be more natural, feel unnatural for. And I think it's the same way, the opposite. Some people, maybe in ways that are more recognizable, they're more comfortable serving, and other people. But I think in both those circumstances that we're serving, and I think no matter what, all of us have a day-to-day life. Even people who maybe sometimes might be a more profile person, we all have a day-to-day life that we live with our families, with our coworkers, behind the scenes. And in those moments behind the scenes for everyone, a lot of service can happen. So we have two examples of imperfect people. I also want to say, while we have these beautiful pictures of both Timothy and Epaphroditus, they are imperfect people. We are not perfect people. We are not going to have perfect examples. But with both these men, we can see their foundation and their understanding belief in Jesus as the foundation of service. And so us, even though we're not perfect, what we think, what we do, what we say matters, and how we interact with other people. And as I said, I think service is often being willing to be faithful in the mundane things that go unnoticed. And so as I was preparing for this lesson, I came across this story from Fred Craddock from Leadership Magazine, and I just want to share it with you. It says, "To give my life for Christ appears glorious. To pour myself out for others, to pay the ultimate price of martyrdom, I'll do it. I'm ready, Lord, to go out in a blaze of glory. We think giving our all to the Lord is like taking a $1,000 bill, laying it on the table, and saying, 'Here's my life, Lord. I am willing to give it all.' But the reality for most of us is that He sends us to the bank and has us cash in the $10,000 for quarters. We go through life putting 25 cents here and 50 cents there. Listen to the neighbor kid's trouble instead of saying, 'Get lost.' Go to a committee meeting. Give a cup of water to a shaky old man in a nursing home. Usually giving our life to Christ isn't glorious. It's done in all those little acts of love and service, just 25 cents at a time. it would be really easy to go out in a flash of glory. It's harder to live the Christian life little by little over the long haul. So I really love this story, and I love this thought about that, about how we can be a living example for Jesus in both the extraordinary moments like Timothy and the ordinary moments of my life. And I really love that story with the picture of just wanting to lay it all down for God, and God saying like, wait, I don't have this huge thing right now. Just little by little, day by day, follow me. Follow me in the unseen things. Follow me in the unknown tasks, and do that. So in our ordinary moments, we're remembering what Jesus did, and we are reflecting this in our lives. So I think one reason I love this story is because it, not right away, but after thinking about it a little bit, it reminded me of my life. So I am a teacher, as I said, and I actually used to teach overseas in China. Right after I graduated from college, I moved there and I lived there for 8 years, and it was wonderful. And it provided me a lot of amazing opportunities. I worked at a Christian school. There were a lot of opportunities for English corners, working with Chinese, sharing the gospel. My school went on service projects where we would work with North Korean refugees or go into schools in underdeveloped regions. And I was able to do a lot of things that compared to my day-to-day life here in America, seemed pretty extraordinary. And after I'd been there for a while, and the reason I actually moved to Lancaster is because I really felt like God was calling me to go to seminary, and I went to the seminary at Lancaster Bible College, and I had a lot of these things that I was doing, but I felt like I didn't have a really strong biblical background and the biblical knowledge in that. And so I came back to seminary and I thought, wow, like I've been doing all these really great things and serving God in all these really great ways. And now I'm going to seminary and I'm going to gain all this biblical knowledge, and like imagine what else he's going to have me do. And so for 2 years while I went to seminary, I had 2 part-time jobs. I worked as a nanny for a family with one boy who was 2 when I started and then around 5 when I finished. And then I also coached soccer shots. I love soccer, but it's coaching with kids who are ages 2 through 5. So both of those were really fun. And so I did my 2 years of seminary and I was working part-time. And at the end of it, I was actually able to do an internship in South Africa for 2 months. And I got back and I thought like, okay, I had a little bit of the mindset like, now I'm ready to go. Now I'm ready to serve God in great ways. Because I was doing stuff before, and now I have this biblical knowledge, and let's go. And I applied for job after job, and I got some interviews, and I could not get hired. And so I finished seminary, and I was gung-ho. I had my $1,000 bill, and I said, God, I have $1,000. I probably would have even said a lot more, like, I am all in. What is this next amazing, spectacular, huge way I can serve you? And for that first year, I was applying to jobs, and it looked like continuing to nanny and continuing to coach soccer for 2 through 5-year-olds and meeting up with friends for coffee and spending more time with my family. And there was no huge thing that was there. And I think I missed it a little bit in those times, that I think I was so focused on, here's my $1,000 bill, I am ready to go, that I did not go into the bank and cash in for change, at least not intentionally right away. So after that I had a whole first year after that, and then at the start of that next year, I actually got a job, and this is going to be the very abridged version of this. So when I started that second year and I had that job, I thought, okay, this is it. This is my $1,000 moment. I had my last year of waiting, and now I'm ready to move on and do bigger and greater things for God and serve in greater ways. And that was just not the plan or year of service that God had for me. So as I said, I was at an after-school program for about 3 months. I was at the church for about 3 months, and then I was teaching pre-K for about 3 months. And those last 2 jobs, I knew they were temporary. They were long-term, they were short-term placements. So I knew that I wasn't building and working for something that was long-term and for personal gain. But I think God just really showed me that it wasn't about what I wanted to do or even what I thought I could do, but I think he just slowed me down and helped me to see that in things that seemingly may seem mundane or ordinary, or like I was not building in a long-term career way or a long-term future way for myself, that I could serve. So behind the scenes, putting things together for Sunday morning at church, or when I was teaching pre-K, stopping and listening to a 4-year-old tell a story, or helping them tie their shoe. So those were maybe unseen tasks, and as much that was unknown, the unknown tasks of that year. God was asking me, are you willing to serve? Will you have joy in serving, even if I'm not asking you to place the $1,000 down. I keep saying $1,000 bill, but there's not a $1,000 bill. But place that down. I don't think, maybe if there is, I've never seen it. And ask me to get those quarters, and just day by day, in small ways, live out a life that was service. So I think I've already said this, but I'm going to say it again. One of the last main points that we have is I can be a living example of Jesus by being willing to serve in both extraordinary and ordinary moments of my life. Because I do think, maybe not everyone, but I do think there are times when God asks us to step up and serve in a big way. And I don't want to discount that. We cannot discount Timothy's life of service. But even if you have those moments, most of our lives are lived in the unseen moments, in the ordinary moments. So in the ordinary moments, when we're with our family, when we're at work, when we're in the grocery store, we are remembering what Jesus did for us, remembering that foundation of Jesus coming down in the servant form, remembering those words that we heard in the second part of in Philippians about what God has asked us to do and how to live, how we can shine for others and be that light. And we are living that out. And we can see Timothy and Epaphroditus in our lives, and in both extraordinary and ordinary moments, we can live that way. So for you, if you're a parent, that might look like laundry and dishes. It might look like listening to your child and taking some time to play with them. In work, it might be going out of your way to help a coworker, or if you know that you have a friend who is grieving, taking the time to send the text, taking the time to ask them if there's anything they can do, and actually following up and serving them and doing that. Maybe it looks like being involved in a church, or in the church in a way of service, if you feel like God is leading you to that. Or it could look like serving in another way in the community. So there are a lot of different ways, I think, in our life where you can do no matter what, but day to day, everything we do can be a service. If we are washing the dishes, we know that we can have confidence in who Jesus is and his love that he has had, that his love that he has for us. And as you're washing those, if it is for a roommate or if it's for your family, you can know that you are loving them and blessing them and serving them in those ways. So as we are thinking about joy and service, I just really want to challenge you to think about service in maybe those more extraordinary ways, or ways that we more generally think about, but also just think about service in the ordinary ways, in the unseen tasks, in the ordinary moments of our lives. Are we remembering that our foundation is on Jesus? Are we remembering that we can love and serve others as an outflow of that, and an outflow of modeling Jesus' life, just like Timothy and Epaphroditus did in this week's passage?